This is the American Standard Cadet II toilet, introduced around 1992 and would be made up until the early to mid 2000s. As the name implies, this is the sequel version to the Cadet, and it's a rather disappointing one. But let's take a look at it and see what it has to offer. So the overall design of this toilet really isn't too much to talk about, but it doesn't look too bad either. It has its own style, although it's rather simplistic, as you can tell. The trapway opening is just a standard circular opening, and looks kind of small despite its somewhat large trapway passages. Surprisingly, the tank parts in this one are mostly original. You got the original handle, the original ball cock fill valve, and the original flapper and base. The parts are very simplistic, but they can be interchanged, which is a nice feature if needed. Overall, they're very simplistic, but they get the job done. Let's have a look at a flush. I gotta say, for a front flusher, it has a pretty crazy flush. So the odd thing is, the pulling and siphon power on this toilet is very inconsistent and most of the time not very good. This is reliant on many different factors. One, the power of the flush. If it's too powerful, then the siphon is more than likely not to happen. Not to mention that this toilet is not very siphonic at all, and this has to do with the trapway passages. It's a not very siphonic design. And I've seen this on many different toilets like the Ryan Novara and even something like the Ultra Canterbury, or even the first generation Universal Rental Atlas that has trapway passages similar to that. And it's most of the time not very siphonic and mostly depends on the flush. So if the front rim is very powerful and very swirly, then it lessens the chance of it siphoning out properly. So that's not a very good sign. Not to mention, the quality control really isn't that good either, being very inconsistent from one to another. This most likely relies on the rim jets itself. Sometimes it's pointed down, sometimes it's swirly, other times it's way too powerful and way too weak. It's very inconsistent, and I don't really like that about these toilets. Each one is going to be different from one another, and that's not really a good sign. And this mostly relies on the rim jets, as well as the inconsistent performances as well. Speaking of performance, the performance is not good either. In fact, it's quite bad. This relies mostly on the trapway opening, which is kind of small. While the trapway passages are quite large, the opening does prevent it from performing all too well, which is not a very good sign as well. Now let's have a look at ball rinse. As you can tell, it's quite crappy. Not only does it have a fairly deep rim, but the rim jets are just kind of all over the place. Some of them go straight down, some will swirl, and then some that just miss coverage, like right here for example, that you may have saw. The application and the coverage is not very good, therefore the ball rinse is, unsurprisingly, quite crappy. And that is the American Standard Cadet II toilet, a very underwhelming sequel to the Cadet. While it does have some qualities that make it very interesting compared to some other front flushers, at the end of the day, it's yet another front flusher. Some qualities definitely could have been improved upon, but it could also be made a lot worse. At the end of the day, it's just a very mediocre sequel to the Cadet. But let's put this toilet into the grading scale. Let's grade it. The overall design of the Cadet II actually doesn't look too bad. I especially like the tank design. Overall though, it isn't anything too fancy. I give it a 6. Wow, it's nice to see an example with all the original parts. Outside of that though, they are pretty simplistic and can be interchanged at any time. So of course I'm giving the tank parts a 6. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, the quality control is absolute crap. From the rim just not working properly or being crooked, to the inconsistent power levels, and of course, inconsistent flushes. This toilet definitely has it all. And it's getting a free. The trapway really isn't a very good design. The biggest problem is that it's not very siphonic, and that the opening is pretty small. The passages themselves look decently sized, but the opening is definitely the biggest problem. I'm giving it a 4. Out of all the front flushers we've seen so far, this is easily the best flush of a front flusher. It's honestly quite insane. Every time I find one of these, they're always on steroids when they flush. It's honestly insane how crazy and powerful these are. In fact, sometimes it's too powerful. Even though the flush is visually stunning, it really isn't super practical if you think about it. As well as considering the inconsistent flushes and siphons, I'm dragging it down to a 6 and not a 7. The pulling and siphon power on this toilet is not very good, and it's also very inconsistent. The biggest problem is that the flushes vary from toilet to toilet. If it's way too powerful, it's definitely a lot worse. Not to mention that the trapway is not a very siphonic design at all, so sometimes it rarely siphons, which is not a very good thing. Overall, I give it a 4. To the surprise of no one, the performance is also not very good too, and also very inconsistent. Generally speaking, the standard height elongated versions perform the best, while the others don't perform as good. Once again, the biggest problem is the trapway opening. The trapway passages are decently sized, but the opening is definitely the biggest problem. So I'm giving it a 4. It's not very good. Another not so shocking thing is that the ball rinse is absolute crap. From the inconsistent ranges not working and or being crooked, it's not very surprising that it's like this. It's obviously getting a 3. The survivability, to the surprise of no one, is also not very good. That's a typical front flusher for you, and this toilet really isn't much different. This toilet is getting a 4. Now let's talk about the overall value of this toilet. Considering that this was the sequel toilet to the original Cadet line, the Cadet II is a very disappointing sequel. It's just a generic front flusher if you think about it, and it has all the typical problems that a front flusher has. Bad performance, bad quality control, crappy ball rinse, and all the rest. The only thing that this thing has an upper hand at is having a better flush, due to the crazy flush that it has. But sometimes that can be impactful for the overall functionality. Outside of that, this toilet really doesn't offer anything else. It's just another run-of-the-mill front flusher with the typical problems that a front flusher has, making this toilet a very mediocre sequel if you think about it, especially compared to the original Cadet lineup, excluding the 5th generation of course. With that in mind, the value is easily a 4. The final score of the American Standard Cadet II toilet is a 44 out of 100. You know, for being a sequel to an iconic model line, this is a very underwhelming sequel. It's just a generic front flusher at the end of the day with most of the problems still intact. That may have been a sequel, but the third installment isn't going to be much better.